time for another episode of Bad Therapists, where we look at the ways which therapists put their licenses at risk due to poor and sometimes unethical decision making. Now, for today's story, I want you to think about how you might have acted in this therapist's position. We begin in February of 2020 when a client wants to talk about the severe depression and anxiety he feels due to his divorce. The therapy begins with some intensive 2 times a week therapy to really try and get through this initial strong emotional reaction. But after a couple months, they decide to bring in the partner, the ex-wife, to work on their relationship in some ways. This goes on for a couple months, after which the original client decides he no longer wants to continue the therapy work. Now, transitioning from that individual work to couples therapy is something that some therapists would say is not appropriate, but others might argue is okay. And I wonder what you think. Let me know in the comments below. Either way, a few months later in September, the original client asks the therapist to mail a copy of his records to him, and the therapist obliges and sends them off in the mail. Around the same time, though, the former wife contacts that same therapist and says that she believes he is a danger to their children, that he's been drinking heavily, has a firearm at home, and is a suicide risk. And she asks the therapist to write an opinion letter saying as much and send it off to the wife. And then in October, during a child custody hearing, both the medical records and the opinion letter are revealed by the wife, unbeknownst to the husband. He had no idea that these things were going to show up in court. Now, before we go on to the final little bit here, I'm curious whether any of you might have written a similar letter if you genuinely feared for those children. But now let's get to Act 3 of our story, because this is the part where the first client files a complaint with the board for releasing his confidential health information without permission. And as the board opens their investigation, the therapist provides some paperwork, including specifically a consent to release information form. That's the form you can sign that says, hey, you are allowed to share my medical info. Except the board found a few issues with the form, like their names were spelled incorrectly and the signature didn't match. And as the investigation continued, the therapist went on to provide less than consistent answers to questions. As one example, at one point she said she didn't have the original client's address and therefore couldn't send the letter even though she wanted to, and then later said, actually I did send him a letter, just kidding. Needless to say, at no point did she ever demonstrate that she had permission to write the letter, provide the letter, or give copies of the medical records to the wife. Now, interestingly, she hasn't lost her license outright. Instead, it's been suspended and she is now under supervision, meaning in order to get her license back, she has to do therapy under the supervision of a licensed therapist who will then sign off and confirm that she's now doing things completely ethically and above board. So what do you think? Was that a good outcome, or should she have lost her license entirely? Let me know in the comments below.